Hi, welcome back as we continue to explore the implications of the curse in Genesis 3:14 to 21. In the last session, I tried to show all the details of translation and cultural context that help us understand exactly what the curse is conveying here. And we especially relied on the work of Carol Meyer's incredible close study of the translation of verse 16. You see the New Revised Standard Version on the screen there, where it describes, "I will greatly increase your pangs in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children." But last time we explored this version of the translation from Carol Meyer's, where she highlights that rather than pangs in childbearing, the issue is two separate things: toil, itzavon there, matching the man's toil in verse 17, and pregnancies. And as she knows, I didn't mention this specifically in the video last time, that the Hebrew word heron, that's translated here as childbearing, means pregnancies. It does not mean childbirth or the concept of childbearing as a vocational task throughout a mother's life, but the act of pregnancy. So what's being increased here are toil for the woman and the man, without specifying what that toil is, pregnancies for the woman, and struggle with the earth for food. In other words, we saw last time that the curse sentences the woman to the functions of agriculture and patriarchy as a woman, and the man to the struggles of agriculture as a man. And if you want to consider it, the quote-unquote benefits of patriarchy, but we don't see any named here. So you see on the right side of the screen, last time we looked at the plot and the outcome of the curse in terms of what that looked like. Today, I'd like to look at how this is a satire on both the Solomon story and Babylon's Enuma Elish, and just a little bit about how what Genesis shows here relates to what we can know about the advent of agriculture and civilization. And I'm really just going to talk about agriculture now. We'll talk more about civilization when we get to chapter 4, verse 17, and Cain's murder of his brother and building of the first city in the Bible. So what we have to look at here is why the authors of Genesis, assuming this is written in exile, would want to present this as the outcome of the primeval disobedience or break between people and God, between people and each other, gender-wise, and between people and the earth. You know, why present it this way? Why establish agriculture and patriarchy as the root problem? So two elements of that. One is, as we saw, the language of the knowledge of good and evil is one that's very important to see where it existed before that, and that's in 1 Kings 3 and Solomon's dream. So let's take a detour from Genesis a little bit and look a little bit at the story of Solomon's reign. Not how he got there, which is told in the earlier chapters, and we'll cover that in the Books of Samuel series that we're doing simultaneously with this one. But once his reign is established, which we see in the previous verse, end of chapter 2, so the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon, first thing he does is make a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, took Pharaoh's daughter, brought her into the city of David, which is to say Jerusalem, until he'd finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem, and basically kept her there. And so then, after intervening thing about sacrifices, he has a dream. And so we see it this way. Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask me what I should give you." And as he goes through this, let's pay attention to a little bit of what he says here. First, he praises the God in the dream for doing such good things for his dad, which is basically a whitewashing of all the horrible things that David did, from the murder of his lover Bathsheba's husband Uriah to many other acts of extortion, violence, and vengeful murder. So he whitewashes his father, which of course makes it look good for him. And now we hear this. "And now, O Yahweh, my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, although I am only a little child." And we realize we don't know how old he is. King Josiah in 2 Kings 22 is said to have been instated to be king at age 8. And we know, if you know a little of the history of Europe, how dynasties can work that way. You never know when the existing king will die and how old his sons, if he has sons, will be. So we really don't know how old Solomon is. Maybe that's a figure of speech. He's only a little child. Or maybe he's actually a little child. We don't know. And then he says, "I do not know how to go out or come in," which is a figure of speech for leading the army in battle. So David is said to go out and come in, go out from Jerusalem with the army and come back in safely. So he has no experience in the military, unlike his father David, and he claims to be an only child. "And as your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted, which sadly his father David had done and was chastised for at the end of 2 Samuel, but that's another issue. So then, given these preambles, he says, "Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil, for who can govern this your great people?" So he ends it with a rhetorical question, and the answer to that rhetorical question obviously is the only people who can govern your great people, Yahweh, is you. And that was the issue in 1 Samuel 8 at the very beginning of the monarchy question, when Samuel, the bridge figure, prophet, judge, priest-like figure, in a way, at least certainly a kingmaker, sees the rejection of God as king as a sellout. But Yahweh says to go ahead with it and see how it turns out. And of course, what it turned out to was to lead to exile. But before it led to exile, and that's of course the immediate issue for the authors of Genesis, it led to oppression. And let's see how that goes. Because if you're not familiar with the Solomon story, and recognizing this narrative in 1 King was certainly meant to praise Solomon, let's look at a couple of the details that reveal that maybe there's more going on than what it sounds like. So Solomon awakes from a dream, and then he has there's the story of the two prostitutes and the baby, and we won't get to that now. And then the writer skips to chapter 4 to a bureaucratic list of all the officials, and that usually loses people's attention. But let's pay attention to a couple details here. So in verse 6 we hear Ahishar was in charge of the palace, and Adoniram, son of Abda, was in charge of the forced labor. So suddenly there are forced labor here. And then in the next verse, Solomon had 12 officials over all Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each one had to make provision for 1 month in the year. So, and here are their names. So provisions of 12 officials to provide food. And the implication is that it parallels the 12 tribes, or at least these 12 regions from which they are set to get food. It's not like these people are growing food themselves or going out and hunting, gathering, right? They're appropriating food from the people who serve under Solomon, using that forced labor probably to grow the food, as the Babylonians did and others, and whatever means necessary to achieve the king's goal. And so although we hear this happy summary, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea, and the ate and drank were happy, we can pretty much attribute that to royal propaganda. Because we then see this over the next couple of verses. Solomon's provision for 1 day was 30 cores of choice flour and 60 cores of meal. And then it goes on to describe animals. But since our conversation for today is about agriculture, that's what we see here. 30 cores of choice flour and 60 cores of meal a day. And these officials are responsible for it a month. So let's get some sense of that. According to scholars, a core is an ancient measure that's approximately 10 to 12 bushels. So if we're talking wheat, a bushel of wheat weighs about 60 pounds. So a core of wheat would weigh somewhere between 600 and 700 pounds. And this says 30 cores. So we're talking about 18 to 20,000 pounds, or 9 to 10 tons of choice flour a day, and 60 cores of meal. So 10 tons of choice flour, another 20 tons of obviously less quality meal a day. 30 tons of grain to feed Solomon. Now, plainly, this isn't feeding him personally. We can understand this as feeding his royal house, or who knows how far, because that much grain would feed a lot of people, not to mention all the other animals here that are described, not as sacrificial animals, but as food animals, all that cattle, sheep, deer, etc. So, in other words, Solomon's kingdom, like the Babylonian kingdom, like the Egyptian kingdom, is running on slave-based agriculture. And what Solomon is claiming as what enables him to do that effectively is the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, the idea that he's reigning with divine authority in the name of God. And that sense of reigning in divine authority as God's son is something that we'd hear also in Psalm 2 and echoes into the question of Jesus, but we won't go there for now. Simply the point is that Solomon's asking for the knowledge of good and evil, as listened to through Genesis 3, highlights that he's doing exactly the wrong thing. He's doing exactly what the Genesis story is trying to get humans not to do, which is to allow God to have the space to rule, especially in areas where humans have no knowledge. And that's exactly what Solomon admits. He has no experience and he has no knowledge, and so the only thing that would enable him to reign effectively is divine knowledge. And although 1 Kings suggests that that's a good thing, Genesis several hundred years later probably suggests otherwise. So that's the Solomon side of it. How about the Enuma Elish side of it? Well, let's put this little quote up here on the screen so you can see here. This is from the section of Enuma Elish where Marduk has already succeeded in accomplishing what he wants to accomplish, and he's being praised here with many royal divine sort of names. So pay no attention to the details of names here, but let's just hear what's attributed to the will of Marduk here. The Lord, that's Marduk, who sprinkles the fields, irrigator of heaven and earth, who establishes seed rows, who forms fine plowland in the steppe, dam and ditch regulates, who delimits the furrow. And moving down a little bit, we see specifically who furnishes millet, causes barley to appear, who causes rich rains over the wide earth, provides vegetation. So you can see very clearly, Enuma Elish says that agriculture exists at the will of Marduk, their chief god, and therefore serves the Babylonian Empire precisely as it served the Solomonic Empire. So we can clearly see this as being presented against the notions of agriculture as divinely given, as Enuma Elish says. What about patriarchy, and what about the role of the women? Let's go back to our Genesis passage for a minute and note something that it says here. So the woman will have increased pains, toil, and childbearing, which is, say, pregnancies. Why would that be the situation of agriculture? Well, as many scholars of the ancient world have noted, if people were foraging people, it used to be called hunter-gatherers, or nomadic small cattle nomads, like we'll see Abraham and Sarah and those folks being, where they're not settled in one place, but they are not hunter-gatherers either. They're living off the animals that they bring with them and whatever else that they can get by trade, as we'll see. Then having two children at most makes sense, because a woman can nurse two children at the same time, and more than two children not only can't be nursed and are additional source of food, but three small children are a lot of burden. They take a lot of time and energy, as any of you are parents know. They're not easily mobile. They certainly can move quickly in an emergency, and one parent can carry one of each of two children in an emergency, but carrying three is awkward. So families were often limited to two children. More children was not necessarily an advantage in a migratory, mobile people. But with agriculture, people became settled, of course, settled around the land in which they're farming. And we'll see how that takes place in cities in Genesis 4 and on. But cities were not the only place that could happen. Israelite farming probably started in the hill country of Judah, and it would have been in small villages, almost certainly unwalled. And I'll show you a picture of one of those houses in just a moment. So it's with settling that people can have more children because they don't have to worry about carrying them around or nursing them. But also, more children mean more farm workers. And it's important to recognize that while we might think of children as sweet little gifts of God that provide all kinds of entertainment and awe for us, and that's all true, in the ancient world, in a farming environment, children were workers. And they were workers you didn't have to pay, even less than slave laborers, because you could obviously boss your children around. So if any of you ever grew up on a farm, you might know you were probably out there milking the cow and doing what needed to be done as early as you could walk around and do it, and early in the morning too. So more children, more pregnancies can happen with agriculture. But for a woman, that meant every pregnancy was a risk of a death sentence, because it's really not until the mid and late 20th century that modern medicine, especially with cesarean sections, can remedy the common risk that pregnancy was to women. So as much as women might get excited, oh, I'm pregnant, I'm going to have a baby, until very recently, maybe you'll have a baby and maybe you'll die. So more pregnancies is more risk of dying for women, in addition to the toil that's involved in both trying to raise kids and do your share of the agriculture. And that results in patriarchy in the sense that we'll see unfolding here, not in the sense that men boss women around all over the place, but in the sense of a gender division of labor. And our greatest source of the connection between agriculture and patriarchy is the classic book that you can see the cover of here from Gerda Lerner here in The Origins of Patriarchy. And although she was writing decades ago now, she established very clearly that patriarchy had its origins in the Middle East in this very time period, with the ascension of agriculture and division of labor. That's what we can understand about their purpose for it, in promoting the view that that kind of lifestyle was not going to be good for the man or woman. It would be a lot of work and suffering, and as we'll see in succeeding chapters, in the long haul, it's not good for humans or the earth, and it certainly isn't God's will. So let's just look very briefly at a little bit of the historical question. And to do that, let's look at the map here, and I'll expand it to the full screen so we can get some sense of what the issue here. So this map shows the journey toward exile here, and that's helpful for our purposes. Because if you were a Jerusalemite and you'd live your life there in the city, and maybe you'd seen the terrace farming around there, but you had to walk this approximately 700 miles to get to Babylon, what might you see along the way? There is not historical evidence of hunter-gatherer cultures along there, but there's certainly plenty of evidence of people living outside of cities, people living much like Abraham and Sarah are portrayed as trying to avoid cities, and there are still some of those people to this day that are camel nomads or small cattle nomads in that region. And so you certainly would have seen them 2,600 years ago. And maybe in the time it took you to walk 700 miles, even at 20 or 25 miles a day, that would be a long time, more than a month, as you can calculate for yourself. You might have thought not only about what went wrong, but what you're seeing in the landscape around you might inspire you to consider what you might do instead. And although the Israelites couldn't know about the history of this, and they probably didn't know much about their own history other than it was in the text they created, they obviously didn't have tools like archaeology or carbon dating or other things that enable us to gain a lot of information that is only recently available to humans. They would certainly have seen what we can't see, which is an environment where cities are the rarity and people just living out on the earth amongst the animals and the plants was the norm. But what about us? We can know a lot more about this than they did. And to see that, I want to just bring up a few books. I won't talk about these. I would encourage you to be interested in them yourself. But the one that got me started here, as you can see, is John Zerzan's Elements of Refusal. And I won't get into how I got in that book, but he cites Jared Diamond there for this quote. The adoption of agriculture, supposedly our most decisive step toward a better life, was in many ways a catastrophe from which we have never recovered. That quote, as I put up there, is from an article he wrote originally in 1987, reprinted here in 1989, called The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race. And Zerzan takes that and builds upon Diamond's insight by going back to the work of anthropologist Marshall Sahlins, whose book cover you can see there, which was a landmark. And what Sahlins shows there, using economic data and charts and graphs that are not that interesting unless you're an economist, but very helpful, is he analyzes using hunter-gatherers from when he was studying in the 1950s or so, the book is written in the 70s, and compared the amount of work involved, the number of calories gained from work with agriculturalists and hunter-gatherers. And in a term he invented, the original affluent society, he showed in graphic detail how hunter-gatherers worked much less and were much healthier than agriculturalists. And he was an anthropologist, not a historian, so he was looking simply at the results of the field labor he did there. But he set the questions that led many others to do other work. So now you can see on the screen a pair of books, curiously, with the same title, Against the Grain, and the James Scott one written more recently, knowing that it's got the same title as Manning's book. Both of these books highlight something that Diamond and Zerzan and others have tried to highlight, summarizing the work of much scholarship, and I'd highly recommend them if you're interested in this question. They're both pretty easy reading, which is, as Zerzan's book title, Elements of Refusal, suggests, humans did not embrace agriculture as a great innovation, but only use it as an emergency, recognizing how much more work it was, how much harder life would be in an agricultural context than in one where you just walk around and pick up what you can find, or where your community can arrange things so that you can lure the animals into a zone where you can easily knock off enough of them to keep you fed for quite a while and smoke the rest so that you can eat later. Much less work to do that, and cultures all did that except for emergency circumstances starting roughly in 12,000 BCE. The Israelites did agriculture too, but as you can see from this image of the classic four-room house, they did it, and they don't have a village image, they did it in small villages where this kind of house would hold an extended family, and they'd be clustered together, so there might be 100 people in an acre around these houses, and as far as we can tell, had pit storage. So they engaged in small-scale agriculture, just enough to maintain a village of 150 or 200 people. Very different, of course, than the imperial agriculture under Solomon or under the Babylonians, which is grounded, of course, in the work of slaves. So that's what our authors are trying to say here, and that's what we can know, some of which they couldn't know, about how right they were, that agriculture was a dead-end path that humans got onto. In, relatively speaking, the last few minutes of our collective life, if you consider that humans as a broad category have been around for about 2 million years, and Homo sapiens for about 100,000 or maybe 200,000 years, depending exactly on you measure, and agriculture for 10 or 12. So a tiny percentage. So just like the Genesis authors were saying there, it's not too late to get off the agricultural bandwagon and return to what God intended us, how God intended us to live. It's not too late for us now. But that's beyond the scope of what the purpose of this series is. So I'll stop there, and we'll pick up next time with the final scene in the Garden of Eden story. See you next time.